Do you worry that a lot of the work that was done after 9/11 is coming undone?
I worry that a lot of it's been set aside by the Obama administration. And now, 15 years later, it's become fashionable in some circles, including sometimes on the Hill with some of my own Republican friends, that we've forgotten or choose to set aside the events of 9/11. When you have 19 guys armed with airline tickets and box cutters come to the United States, hijack aircraft, kill 3,000 of our people, take down the World Trade Center, blow a hole in the Pentagon, would have taken out probably the White House or the Capitol building if it hadn't been for the passengers on United 93. That's a history-altering event. It's an act of war. It's worse than Pearl Harbor. And yet here we are 15 years later, and people are sort of thinking, well, that was a one-off affair, or we can afford to get rid of the database we'd built with the terror surveillance program, turn it all over to the companies, and ease off on the policies we put in place that I believe prevented further attacks. And it's unfortunate. It's as though we're going to have to get to the point where we have another attack before everybody's ready to really buckle down again and do those things that are necessary to keep us safe.
So one of the things that was said at the end of the Bush administration was the policies that you put in place are succeeding, and the evidence of that is there hasn't been another attack.
Right.
And there hasn't been certainly another. There have been attempts in the United States. There have also been some lone wolf or self-starter terrorist attacks, but there hasn't actually been an attack. Is that a testimony to the capabilities of the intelligence community? A testimony to the incapabilities of the terrorist group? How do you see that? Because I think that might be what President Obama would say. What's your evidence?
Yeah. Well, we had reporting, for example, right after 9/11, that al-Qaeda was seeking a nuclear device in Pakistan, where they have nuclear devices. We had to be concerned from the very beginning about those kinds of things. And we had reporting about attacks that never came off. Attack on the highest building on the west coast of the United States, attack on in downtown London. So it's clear that what we did, the terror surveillance program and so forth, did put in place the necessary steps. The fact of that we didn't get hit again, I really think has a lot to do with the vigilance, with the airline security measures we put in place. We had attacks fail, such as the underwear bomber over Detroit. So there's no doubt in my mind, but what it was a positive, successful policy. And so the notion that Barack Obama brought to office was that, first of all, that we'd overstepped the bounds. Remember when he went to Cairo? And he apologized to the Muslim world for our overreaction to 9/11. One thing that I found out later was that if you look at some of the documents that were released when Snowden stole documents that we uncovered when Liz and I were doing our latest book, was that our ambassador to Japan had sent a cable back to the White House during that first year when Obama was doing his apology tour, saying the Japanese had rejected his request that he be allowed to go to Hiroshima and apologize for our having dropped the bomb on Hiroshima in World War II. So he set a tone out there that, and a set of policies, including what he's done to defense, that has persuaded a lot of our friends and allies around the world that they can no longer count on the United States, that we are not, that we don't have their back. And I think it shows in terms of the relationships we have with so many of those folks that the United States is no longer looked to as the go-to people to deal with the terrorist problem.
Let me ask you about the Middle East. It is not the place it was in 2008 when you and President Bush left office. There are conflicts from Yemen to Syria to Lebanon to Iraq to Libya throughout North Africa. Al-Qaeda is really back, and many suggest it's as strong as it was on September 10th, 2001. What do you see as the root of those conflicts? Do you think the United States bears any responsibility for that?
I don't. I think some people have suggested our actions, in effect, promoted or generated 9/11. That's hogwash. We were not doing anything that merited that attack. It was the terrorists themselves who decided they wanted to hit the United States. The Mideast has been a place for conflict for a long time. I mean, when I was Secretary of Defense, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and we had to do Desert Storm. But at the time, we were able to organize the entire region in order to prevail, if you will. There was a great coalition put together. We had a $60 billion war that cost us $5 billion because others chipped in. It was a unique moment when you pull all of that together, and when the U.S. was clearly preeminent in the region. Since then, over time, obviously, there have been the rise of ISIS, the development of efforts to establish a caliphate, which they've successfully done now in Syria and Iraq. We've seen efforts by the Iranians to dominate. They now are sort of preeminent, if you will, in Beirut, in Damascus, in Yemen. The IRGC has been very, very active over the years. The Iranians have been very active over the years, pursuing the title they bear as the world's worst state sponsor of terror. And all of that's been going on now for a long time before we got involved.
So one argument I often have with people in Washington is about whether the Iraq War was a triggering factor. There's a suggestion that a lot of people like to make, and it's not really a partisan suggestion, more of an ideological one, that getting rid of Saddam Hussein just sort of ripped the lid off the Middle East, and it was from thence that everything began to topple regimes, the Arab Spring. What do you say to that?
Well, I say you've got to look back at history. We had a very serious nuclear proliferation problem in the Middle East that goes back to 1981, long before we did anything vis-a-vis Saddam Hussein. But in 81, he had a nuclear program at the Osirik reactor outside Baghdad. The Israelis took it out. When I was Secretary of Defense in the summer of 90, I was visited by my Israeli counterpart, the Defense Minister, Misha Ahrens, and the senior uniformed officer, Ehud Barak, and they showed me evidence that Saddam had started up in 1990 a nuclear program again, and then it was pretty far along. In Desert Storm, we went in, we took out that program. The IAEA went in afterwards and did an investigation and found out that he was much closer than we thought to actually having nuclear capability. This was an independent international atomic energy agency that went in and checked that. That's not something the United States came up with, and that was before we ever got into the WMD debate with respect to when we went in 2003. It's a long history of Saddam Hussein trying to develop weapons of mass destruction. The first intelligence report I saw after I got elected vice president in 2000 warned about Iraq and WMD. So the activities of Saddam Hussein overwhelmingly created ferment and turmoil and raised the specter, especially of a link between terror on the one hand and weapons of mass destruction on the other. He used chemical weapons against thousands of his own people at Halabja in 1988. I mean, he had a well-established track record that he was a troublemaker, and he had invaded Kuwait before, and we did go in with the support of a lot of Democrats, and in 2003, and we achieved our objective in that we got rid of Saddam Hussein. That also precipitated other activities. We found out, for example, that Muammar Gaddafi had a nuclear program, and 5 days after we captured Saddam Hussein, he surrendered all of his nuclear materials to us, his centrifuges, uranium feedstock, weapons design. So the circumstances over there in terms of the problems and the difficulties that we're developing pointed in the direction of what was my biggest fear, which was the possibility that terrorists would ultimately acquire something far deadlier than airline tickets and box cutters and require a nuclear weapon or chemicals or a biological agent. I was quoted in an interview I did about 5 months before 9/11 that was our biggest threat, and I think it still is today. And we've still got a very serious nuclear proliferation problem now that goes back over 30 years.
Right. And the Iranians, of course, are unleashed at this point.
The Iranians are unleashed. I don't want to spend all your time on the subject, but we had 1987, Mr. A.Q. Khan, who put together the Pakistani program, in a hotel in Dubai, sold the Iranians the basic plans for centrifuges for $3 million, 1987. We found, of course, on our watch, when Meir Dagan showed up, the Israeli head of Mossad, that Syria had a nuclear reactor that had been built for them by the North Koreans. The Israelis took it out in the fall of '07. What's worked in that part of the world for dealing with the nuclear problem has been military force or the threat of military force. And the thing about the Obama administration is they didn't pursue that option. Obama wrote it off from the very beginning. What they did was try to bribe the Iranians into being good guys and giving up their program. But the net result of that was to provide them with $150 billion in money that they can spend on supporting terror. We have altered our policies, I think, during the Obama administration in major ways to appease the Iranians, when strength and the possible use of force has been the key in the past, but it hasn't been used in this administration at all. And I think that's to the detriment of our interest.
The perception in the region certainly is that we are looking at the region through the prism of Tehran. Mm-hmm. I agree with you about that. There are candidates for president and members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, mm-hmm. who have suggested that the Middle East was better off and that the world was better off with not just Saddam Hussein in power, but Saddam Hussein and Bashar al-Assad and the strongmen who really characterized the Middle East for the last half century. Right. What do you say to that?
Well, that may make sense, 50 years ago. You wanted to get behind your oceans and be safe and sound and comfortable. But in my mind, all of that ended when terrorist organizations were able to use those territories as a base of operation to train and equip the attack of 9/11. When 19 guys can show up over here with airline tickets and box cutters and kill 3,000 of our people and blow up the World Trade Center. The idea that you can let that set of, what do you want to call them, dictators. Point is that Afghanistan, for example, had become a safe harbor for al-Qaeda. And Syria now is a safe harbor for ISIS. We know they're trying to attack us. They want to hit us in the homeland. They've already launched attacks that have threatened us and our friends and allies, bombing the buses in London, for example, or what happened in France a short time ago. And they've done it here in the United States. And so the notion that we can allow somebody like Saddam Hussein or a situation that's happened in Libya, that it's perfectly okay what they're doing. They can't reach us. They can't hurt us, and that's just not true. Muammar Gaddafi obviously got religion when we took down Saddam Hussein. If we hadn't done that, if he'd been allowed to develop his nuclear program, then he was overthrown by ISIS, then the debate would be, well, who's got the nukes? Has ISIS inherited them from the old regime? Same thing in Syria. If the Israelis hadn't taken out that North Korean-built reactor in Syria, then today that area, Al-Kabar in eastern Syria, occupied by ISIS, they would also now be the proud owners of a nuclear reactor. So developments on the ground over there are, I think, ultimately a direct threat to the United States, to the safety and survival of the United States. Technology has developed. We are vulnerable to those organizations as long as they have access to safe harbors and sanctuary, as long as they have the ability to acquire deadlier weapons. Pakistan is a nuclear program, has had for years. But out of Pakistan emerged A.Q. Khan. He set up his own black market operation. Libya was his biggest customer. After we got Gaddafi's materials, then we went and took down A.Q. Khan. But he has testified, the newspaper story to the effect that the North Koreans now have state-of-the-art centrifuge technology. Where did they get it? Got it from Pakistan. So you've already got sort of the seed of very destructive capabilities that could be used against the United States or our friends and allies. It's there. It's in the Middle East. There was one report that the Iranians paid for the last ballistic missile test by the North Koreans. So the ability for us to say, well, it's okay if Saddam stays in power, he's going to mess with weapons of mass destruction. And he had before. You can argue about how much was there when we went in 2003, but there's no question he's been involved previously, that he's had them and used them. Or the Libyan program, or the Iranian program, or the Pakistani program. It's a place we have to be involved. We're far beyond the point when you could look at it as a remote part of the world and it's all right if there's some dictator over there mistreating his people. It's about our safety and survival as a nation.
Was it a mistake for the United States and NATO to help take out Muammar Gaddafi?
I wasn't involved at that point. I'd left the government, and so I don't know everything there is to know about it. Gaddafi had, to some extent, come around in the sense that he had surrendered his nuclear materials to us. And I just, as not having been part of the process, I'm reluctant to pass judgment on it. I think the follow-through, obviously, has been the destruction of Gaddafi and his regime. ISIS now has a significant presence in Libya. That's right across the Med from Italy and Europe. So, but not having been part of the debate internally, I can't make that judgment.
I have to comment to you that it is ironic to me that a government that rose to power on the back of criticism of the Iraq War and how the aftermath was carried out walked away from Libya as if there were no lessons from the Iraq War.
Right.
It is fascinating. So, Russia is now in Syria. Vladimir Putin has taken the Crimea. We seem to have forgotten about it as a nation already. They're in Donetsk, they're in Luhansk. There's some suspicion they may even go into some of our NATO allied countries. Are we handling Putin correctly?
I don't think so. I think Putin believes he's got a window here that runs to the end of the Obama administration. We've seen him move on to Crimea, as you pointed out, in Ukraine. Now he's in Syria. It's as though he is trying to recreate elements of the old Soviet empire that came apart back in 1991. I think he also has aspirations on the Baltics. I think he'd like nothing better than to be able to put pressure on the Baltics, not so much directly by military action, but they all get all of their energy supplies. Their gas all comes from Russia. They were all part of Russia at one time. The Russians appear to be spending money on trying to influence the internal politics of the Baltics. So if he could stir up enough trouble, I could see him trying to put pressure on the Baltics that they either have to do what he wants them to do, probably withdraw from NATO, or some additional pressures will be brought to bear on the Baltics. I think that's his real objective. Now, will he pull it off? I don't know. And I question at this point how determined NATO would in fact be without strong U.S. leadership. We provide 75% of the funding for NATO. And the defense budgets here in the U.S. have been cut dramatically. That's provided a rationale for the Europeans to go forward and cut their defense budgets as well. So it's worrisome.
It's not just the Democrats who cut defense budgets.
Right.
Republicans and Democrats came together. We've lost $1 trillion over 10 years in defense spending. Why?
Well, because Congress couldn't get its act together back in 2011, passed the Budget Control Act of 2011, but that basically imposed and set up a mechanism through sequestration that in effect says if Congress doesn't get budgets passed and adopted, then the Meade Act falls, the sequester takes place. And what's happened now is instead of the traditional way of doing business in the Defense Department, where you look at the world, identify threats, figure out what we need in order to counter those threats or to cope with them, and then ask for the amount of money that's involved, we don't do that anymore. Now what happens is the inability to come to an agreement has led to the frequent use of the sequester. The Defense Department makes up about 17% of the budget. It takes 50% of the cuts because a lot of the domestic programs have been exempted from sequester. So bottom line is that Congress, and some of it on a partisan basis, some of it on a bipartisan basis, there's no question that there was Republican support for this particular solution. But what it's done over time, it's 4 or 5 years now since we put defense budgets together the way they ought to be put together in relation to the threat, we're now in a situation where Our capabilities are significantly diminished. Rayo Odierno, when he stepped down as the Army chief last fall, said that the United States Army is less ready today than any time in its history. It goes back over 200 years. It's a very, very dangerous situation in the sense that we've conveyed to our friends that we don't want to act on their behalf. We've conveyed to others, including some of our adversaries, that we don't have the capability to act effectively. We've changed, if you look at the strategic concept that always drove our planning in the past, while I was there, of course that was a long time ago, but that we believed we needed to have the capacity to fight two wars simultaneously and enough left over to deal with other things on the side. That's gone. Our forces are so much lower, so much less ready. Other things that are problems, we're not investing as much as we need to in order to counter the capabilities that are developed by the Chinese and the Russians. The Russians are modernizing their strategic forces. The Chinese are as well. The Chinese have developed the capability to take down satellites. They've got a ballistic missile that'll take out an aircraft carrier, conventional warhead. They've taken the islands in the South China Sea, built military bases there. The Russians now are flying provocative missions over parts of NATO territory and along borders with NATO. There's a major shift in the sense in terms of how they look at the United States. They don't fear us anymore. And I think that leads them probably to underestimate or perhaps overestimate how far they can go, but underestimate what's sensitive for us. The world was very safe and stable when the U.S. was the principal power, when we had the military capability to deal with any contingency, and we were prepared to use it when we felt the need. I don't think that's the case anymore. Other point that's crucial is our military advantage for a long time, really since the end of World War II, has been based on our technological edge. We were the first ones with stealth. We were the first ones with precision-guided munitions. We had, remember, Desert Storm and the tremendous capabilities we demonstrated. Nobody could match that. That day's past. The Chinese are moving aggressively to close some of those gaps. The Russians are too, or find ways around it so they come up with countermeasures that are effective against our forces. The whole area of cyber warfare is enormously important. And I worry that we're not doing enough there. And the Chinese have gotten very good at it. So have the Russians, perhaps Al-Qaeda or ISIS. And that capacity to hack into our system, demonstrated it by taking the personnel records of those of us who work for the federal government. It's not personal, but they've done it. And when you think about the vulnerability of our system, our reliance on technology, the extent to which they could hack into our power grid or other key elements of our infrastructure is very real. And we are not doing what we need to be doing because of budget cuts in order to maintain our advantage and guarantee our safety.
You just, in 30 seconds, laid out an enormously compelling case that the United States needs to show leadership, that the United States needs to reinvest, not for offense, but for deterrence. Mm-hmm. What's happened to Congress? What's happened in the Republican Party?
Well, they've. I don't want to blame everybody in the Republican Party, obviously. A lot of it is you haven't had any presidential leadership in this area. He's been going the other way. He loves the sequester. It frees up resources that he can use for his domestic programs. And I say a lot of the domestic programs have been exempted from the sequester. The whole process of putting together budgets has broken down. And I think one of the keys for us has to be, and I've argued this with my friends periodically. They ask me to come up and chat on different matters, which I'm always happy to do. But we have to recognize that our number one priority as a nation, as a government, has to be defense. That's more important than anything else. If you can build nice highways, that's fine. You've got infrastructure you've got to worry about. We've got a lot of things the government does that we want to have done. But nothing's more important than the safety and security of the American people. And right now, that's being shortchanged.
There's no substitute for leadership.
Yeah, exactly right.
It's always such a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
for taking
Danny.
the
Enjoyed
time.
it.